It's the Christmas season, and that means November is over. So it's time to go through every movie I watched in November. On the 3rd, I finished Squid Game. I technically watched the first episode on the last day of October, but I still included it in this video. I made a video essay about this show that I spent a lot of time on, so I would really appreciate it if you checked it out. Next, I watched all of the James Bond films starring Daniel Craig, and I also made a ranking of those films, and you can find it in the iCard. Then I watched I Know What You Did Last Summer. It was good, I guess. I was kind of expecting more from it, but it was basically just the stereotypical average slasher film. It's good, but I mean, there's nothing special about it. The characters weren't really all that interesting, and the killer is super forgettable. In fact, the whole movie isn't very memorable, except for the letter saying, "I know what you did last summer." The pacing was all over the place sometimes and feels rushed, but I had a good time with it. It was an entertaining horror flick at best, but that's all. I definitely liked it, but it wasn't saying anything. There was a big cliffhanger at the end, but I don't really think I'll watch the sequel anytime soon. Solid 7 out of 10. After that, I watched Finch. Finch was different than what I expected it to be. I can't tell you what I expected, but what it is something I can tell you I like. Like many Tom Hanks films, this film's ending was very much bittersweet. The ending was probably my favorite part of the film. It was handled very well and is something about the movie I greatly appreciate. When it comes to the CGI, it's great. A superb example of this is clearly the robot. Everything on the robot's body looks real, is very detailed, and you can tell quite a bit of time was invested into making things look believable, and into making the script believable in this science fiction world. The dog could have easily been real, but there's also a chance it could have been CGI, which if it was, then I applaud the visual effects artist for making it look genuine. This is no surprise, but Tom Hanks is awesome. He gives another amazing performance in this, and delivers the emotion really, really well. I like seeing this small cast because it's just kind of refreshing these days to not see a huge and epic in scale science fiction film. However, that brings me to my biggest issue. These characters have a hard time carrying the entire film without outside influence. It's a self-contained story, basically told with a few characters that are decent enough to help you enjoy the movie, but not make you rush to see it again. Finch is definitely not a bad picture, but it's not even close to one of the best ever created. If it just had a few more interesting characters and plot points to help it do what it wants to, then it would be better, but it's still a sweet and solid Apple TV Plus original. The next day, I watched Army of Thieves. Surprisingly, not too bad. It was a lot of fun, and I had a pretty good time watching it. It's nothing groundbreaking at all, but it's a decent enough movie. The main character was pretty likable, and it was entertaining to see him on this little adventure. The beginning wasn't as good as the end, but I still had a good time with it. I don't think it was quite as good as Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead. I think they're both basically on the same pedigree, but it was still pretty good. Nothing great, just fun, and a bit more rewatchable than Army of the Dead because of that shorter runtime. On the 9th, I watched Krampus. A lot of this movie I really liked, but the parts that I didn't really brought it back. It was mostly the scenes that were meant to be scary that I wasn't a fan of, unfortunately. They were kind of suspenseful, but they felt so silly and fictional and brought me out of the experience. That's my biggest problem with it. It seems too silly even for a movie about Krampus. It has lots of potential to be scary, but all of the creatures helping Krampus were way too fictional. I think actually my favorite part of the movie was the beginning. The setup the movie had was great, and all of the scenes before Beth went to the neighbor's house was really great. The opening sequence of credits was also really good too. Most of the action was pretty decent, even from the kids. I believed the performances for the most part, and they were fine. The design of Krampus was simply sick. He looked awesome, and I couldn't even tell if it was CGI or not. The cinematography was shockingly great as well, same goes with the lighting. For a Christmas horror movie, this was pretty good. It wasn't scary or that funny, but there were some good things about it, so I do recommend it. Next, I watched Clifford the Big Red Dog for the first time this month. Yep, I watched it again later. When I first saw this, I gave it a 5 out of 10. But then after watching it again, I lowered my score to a 4. I honestly thought that I might like Clifford the Big Red Dog, but after watching it, I really hate it. I honestly have no clue why, but kids' films like this always think they need to be set in New York, when in reality, I think I would enjoy this more if it was in a smaller setting. In NYC, it just has unnecessary action, and I wish it had a smaller scale. The CGI on Clifford is simply just mediocre. You can obviously tell he's fake, but it looks okay, and it never extremely distracted me. Somehow, he looked a lot better as a big dog than a small one. I don't know how, but he did. The action is really just okay. The worst one in the ensemble is Emily's friend, who was pretty bad. The young girl who played Emily was pretty good, and I think she did a pretty good job, but she wasn't great. One of the worst things about this film is the plot. It's so generic and seems lazy. For a movie about a big red dog, it didn't need to be about a guy that wanted to capture it. It could have just been something small and it would have been just as entertaining. A lot of the dialogue was very bad. I guess this movie had a good message, but the way they portrayed it was so horrible. The dialogue during the third act feels incredibly forced and it was hard to believe. This is a live-action animation hybrid film that can be compared to others of this year, such as Tom and Jerry, but thankfully a little better. Not good, I felt underwhelmed at times even with my low expectations, and one of my least favorites of the year. Then I watched Home Sweet Home Alone, and I actually liked this? What? I really do not know how it had the blueprints to be one of the worst of the year, but I genuinely enjoyed it and thought it wasn't horrible. It does have a horrible title though. After that, I saw Red Notice. The best thing about Red Notice is that it knows exactly what it is and what it's doing. Some people might not be a fan of what it's doing. I mean, on the surface, it's just a generic action comedy, but Ryan Reynolds and Dwayne Johnson are amazing together. Sure, they may be playing basically the same roles they usually play, but you can't not laugh while watching. There's so many funny moments and so many gripping action sequences. Also, throw in Gal Gadot as the Bishop, and you have yourself an incredibly fun group of actors. You can pick apart the script for being lazy and bland and having some predictable moments, but I can't deny that the twist during the third act was definitely unexpected. It kind of caught me off guard, and I would have liked the film better without it, but it wasn't horrible. Some of the exposition bothered me a lot while watching, but the mix between espionage, comedy, and action was so enjoyable and made for a really fun popcorn flick that you should definitely see as it is on Netflix. The next day, I watched Clifford. Again! I lowered my score and hated it. On the 14th, I watched Klaus. I'm not a big fan of Christmas movies that try to create their own origin story and mythology for Santa Claus. They mostly all come off as very fictional and completely ignore the true story of the actual saint, Saint Nicholas, who was born during the 3rd century on the southern coast of Turkey. While that is the case with this movie, it still has so many great things about it that redeemed the bland and cliche plot. Seeing 2D animation in the year of 2019 is very appealing in my opinion, and it simply looks gorgeous in this. The colors and shadows are so beautiful and the animation looks amazing. The voice acting is also really great. The standout is obviously Terrence Fletcher, J.K. Simmons, who gave a very good performance as Klaus. I enjoyed hearing the voices of Joanne Cusack and Rashida Jones, who both were solid. My biggest flaw is probably the comedy. It wasn't funny to me and sometimes took away from the emotional moments, which would have been enhanced without the comedy. I mostly just think this is a forgettable and predictable holiday movie, but it's very fun and entertaining. Films are meant to entertain people, and Klaus definitely succeeds at doing so. Next, I watched 21 Jump Street. 21 Jump Street proves that Lord and Miller are comedy geniuses. The script is hilarious and the direction is phenomenal. Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill have so much chemistry and their banter impressed me. Johnny Depp's cameo was hilarious and Brie Larson was surprisingly great. I absolutely loved the ending as well. It was complete bonkers and was so crazy, so I loved it. The plot is actually a very interesting concept for a film, and I really enjoyed it in this. It was very fun to see older cops pretending to be in high school, and it obviously lended to very funny moments. I was rooting for the main characters to succeed throughout the whole runtime, and I was also trying to figure out the same things they were. We, the audience, figured things out the same time the leads did, and I really liked that about it. Other than that, that's about all I have to say. It's not a movie that has a lot of stuff to critique, but it is just a really fun satire on the action buddy cop genre. Then I watched Home Alone 3. It just doesn't have the magic of the original two. I still like it though. The robbers really suck. After that, I rewatched Jungle Cruise. I don't like it quite as much as I did before, but it's still entertaining and it's nice to have it on Disney+. A few days later, I watched Ghostbusters Afterlife in the theater. It's probably the best Ghostbusters sequel we could have gotten, and it hit all of the emotional beats perfectly. The same day, I watched Tick, Tick, Boom! 2021 is a great year for live-action movie musicals. In the Heights, Dear Evan Hansen, Tick, Tick, Boom, and soon West Side Story. It's awesome, especially since I'm a musical theater kind of guy. Unless West Side Story blows me away, which it could since it's a Spielberg film, I think Tick, Tick, Boom will be my favorite musical of the year. Everything about it is artistically beautiful. The film's focus is evident, and rather than exploring certain themes piece by piece, it stays on course and seamlessly comes together in the third act. The themes it does portray are prominent to make the audience feel emotions, and what helps it even more is the cast. Andrew Garfield does a phenomenal job. His acting and vocal range are perfect to play Jonathan Larson. I never knew Garfield could sing until now, and while the use of autotune is definitely there, his voice sounds wonderful. I was occasionally annoyed by Vanessa Hudgens' whiny singing voice, but it was fine and at least she hit the right notes. Speaking of music, I love the songs. They're incredibly catchy and the lyrics are very unique. The soundtrack has been on loop for me, and personally my favorites are 3090, Louder Than Words, Therapy, and Why. Even though this is Lin-Manuel Miranda's directorial debut, he knows what he's doing, and it shows. You can definitely tell he's passionate about the storyline, and the way he directs it is amazing. I can confidently say that Tick Tick Boom is a new favorite of the year, and one that I really recommend to everyone. On the 21st, I watched King Richard. Tennis is a sport I like to play, though I'm not into it as much as other sports. Nevertheless, King Richard was still a powerful sports biopic. Will Smith is as good as everyone is saying. He deserves the Best Actor award he has been waiting to get, and this would be the best time for it. He easily gives one of his greatest performances, and whilst this is more of a serious role, he was a joy to watch. Richard is the main character of the film, whereas Venus and Serena are in the spotlight. We get to see those characters' development throughout the film, and even though Richard is the lead character, the film is more focused on showing us the journey of Venus and Serena. It was fun seeing them play tennis and improve with each game or practice. Oh, and spoilers up ahead really quick, you can skip to this timestamp. I love how Venus is practicing so hard throughout this movie, and yet at the end she loses her final game. It makes her seem like a real person, which she is, and it lets the audience understand that. None of the characters seem fabricated, and I love that. I really felt the runtime of this movie. I don't think it needed to be nearly 2.5 hours, and it did drag in the middle. My favorite parts of the movie were the beginning and the end, unsurprisingly. King Richard is everything I expected, and that's all. Uplifting plot, good characters with good performances, and an impressive screenplay. Next, I watched Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is the best Thanksgiving movie. It's definitely going to become a yearly holiday viewing for me. Why? It's a blast. It's one of the funniest and most entertaining Steve Martin movies out there. I cannot believe how hilarious John Candy and Steve Martin are when working together. You can tell they have a lot of chemistry and their improv is amazing. There's actually a 3.5 hour cut of this movie with two extra hours of pure, hilarious improvisation by the two. I still have yet to see a bad John Hughes film. Each one is very funny and entertaining. I doubt he has made a film that isn't at least enjoyable. His direction is just amazing in everything, especially in here. I love the way he directs his movies. All of his movies that I've seen have the same distinct style. 80s comedy with a very 80s soundtrack. Most movies of his you can tell are his, and I love that. The only one I didn't like as much was Uncle Buck, but it was just okay. It definitely deserves a rewatch from me. Other than the cast and crew, the script is extraordinary. It's not just funny, it's also got a lot of heart. The ending was shockingly heartwarming, and the characters we follow are great. They're not layered, and they're very simple, but you are invested in them. John Candy's character is annoying, but at the same time likable, and you feel bad for him. The script writes him very well, and John Candy pulls them all together and wraps it with a bow. Steve Martin's character is arrogant and selfish, but you see where he's coming from and you can't deny it. We would all act the same way in his situation. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is somehow a perfect movie for Thanksgiving, yet a perfect transition into Christmas. I've already started watching Christmas movies, but you know what I mean. It's the combination of being hilarious and heartwarming, and it's one of my new favorite Steve Martin films, as well as John Hughes films. May John Hughes and John Candy rest in peace. Then I watched Venom: Let There Be Carnage. This is a superhero film that knows exactly how silly it is. Some people hate that about it, and I'm not the biggest fan of it either, but I can appreciate that they wanted to commit, and they did. I'm not too keen about how Venom is more of a comedic character than a threatening one, but as soon as I got used to it, then it was a really fun time. Woody Harrelson as Carnage was perfect, though I was disappointed about how his character was constructed. He was certainly better than the villain in the 2018 film, who was one of the most forgettable comic book villains ever. Carnage's story seemed rushed, as well as Shriek's. She was barely in it, and we were still supposed to like her character as a villain. I definitely didn't. In fact, I kind of hated her. Yes, and I have to address the post-credit scene, which, once again, I'm going to be getting into heavy spoilers, so you can skip to this timestamp. I couldn't avoid the spoilers before watching, but I was still excited. I mean, I love Tom Holland's Spidey. I was so excited to see what they did with the post-credit scene. I had heard that people were still going crazy, even though they knew what it was going to be. And I was disappointed. I know, it's just a post-credit scene. I shouldn't have expected more. But I did, and since Tom was only on the TV, I was disappointed. This film features so much more action than the first. That film didn't have action until like 40 minutes through. This one starts way sooner. Also, I didn't like the romance between Tom Hardy and Michelle Williams in the first film. It's still here, but it's much less significant. The comedy doesn't always land, but you still love how fun the movie is as a whole. And this one is more funny than the first. The 1.5 hour runtime was a big worry for me, and after seeing it, it was a huge problem. It rushes through plot points that should have been developed more. Don't get me wrong, I love a short and sweet movie, but to fulfill what this movie wanted to do, it should have been longer. Venom: Let There Be Carnage didn't surprise me, but it didn't really disappoint me. It's mediocre at best, but I had such a fun time with it, I had to give it a 7.5 out of 10. Throughout the month, I watched all of the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, as well as Andrew Garfield's. I'm not going to talk about them right now, but I will talk about them in my new Spider-Man ranking when No Way Home comes out.
Pizza time.
After that, I watched 8-Bit Christmas. 8-Bit Christmas is basically Diary of a Wimpy Kid mixed with A Christmas Story and Jingle All the Way, set in the 80s. I say Diary of a Wimpy Kid not only because Steve Zahn plays an angry dad, but the way the kids interact with each other reminds me of those films, which is a good thing because I love Diary of a Wimpy Kid and A Christmas Story. Except for The Long Haul, because that movie really sucks. What makes this movie so good are the lead characters. Jake, both kid and adult, was a character that I related to and had a fun time watching. I think a big reason I liked him so much was because of the performances his character had. Both Neil Patrick Harris and Winslow Fegsley gave life to the character, and I really liked that. The film isn't as filled with Christmas spirit as you might expect, because most of the film comes from the kids trying to get a Nintendo, but when it does have the spirit, it gets you in the mood for the holidays. It has a forced message, but at least it makes sense at the end, and it is still very good. The film didn't make me laugh very much for being a family comedy, but I would say that it was pretty funny. It got a few chuckles from me, and the jokes that didn't land at least weren't cringy. The 80s references were pretty cool, especially because the 1980s is a decade I've been fascinated with for a while. It's one of the best decades for pop culture, and setting this film in that decade made it 2 times better. 8-Bit Christmas isn't one of the best, or one of my favorite Christmas movies, but the best thing about it is how fun it is. It's the type of movie that families will watch together over the years, though I don't think it's going to become a cult classic like A Christmas Story did. It's not too memorable, but I had a great time watching it. Next, I watched the 2020 DCEU movie, Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. Why is that title so long? Birds of Prey is one of the many films that has been buried deep down in the bottom of my watch list, so I'm glad I've finally gotten to see it. It isn't amazing, but it isn't bad. I feel like I'm split down the middle about it, but I definitely did like most of it. I don't really know why this movie is called Birds of Prey, because it is definitely just a Harley Quinn movie. Yeah, the Birds of Prey are in it, but the entire movie is devoted to giving Harley Quinn a story, not her team. The bad thing about that is that I didn't really like her character. Margot Robbie was great, but her character wasn't likable like she was in other movies. The action was stunning. The choreography was very impressive, and while most of the action sequences feel the same, they all have style. Therefore, I enjoyed them and loved the colorful aspect about them. When Harley Quinn saw glitter replacing blood, it looked really cool, but also showed how crazy her character is. On the other hand, this movie feels like it wants to be something that it's not. It feels like it wants to be a female version of Deadpool, though it didn't replicate its success. I haven't seen Deadpool yet, I've just heard about it. It doesn't have much originality in its core, but I guess it's just a fun time. I know I've been saying that about many movies in this video, but I just watched a lot of fun movies this month. Birds of Prey, Shazam, and Zack Snyder's Justice League all give me hope for the future of the DCEU. It was a bumpy road along the way to get to these films, but I think that Warner Brothers finally figured out how they wanted to handle this universe. Black Adam, don't disappoint. The same day, I watched Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands. Edward Scissorhands is Tim Burton's most creative film. By creating this dark fairy tale, he makes a charming yet eerie tone that is present at the beginning to the end. It's his most pleasant fantasy story and a poetically glorious one. I wouldn't call it a favorite of mine at all, though I really like how the themes are presented. They aren't shoved into our faces, they're minuscule, but still big enough for the audience to pick up on. Edward Scissorhands is a smart and fairly accurate way of depicting how society would react to a being such as Edward, or just anyone who is different in one way or another. It's also a bittersweet love story, and one of its strengths is that it mixes these characteristics greatly. It also adds gothic aspects and makes something truly unique. I really love so much of this movie, but I just couldn't get past some of the things that disappointed me. The sets looked really fake and bothered me the whole time. Johnny Depp was amazing as Edward, but the makeup on him seemed excessive. That might be the point, but when his face turned purple, in my head I was asking the crew why they needed to do that. Also, why would they have Edward sleep in a waterbed when he has scissors for hands? That seemed so stupid to me, and it was just a plot device. In fact, there were several plot devices and conveniences that I wasn't a fan of. From the opening moment we hear the old woman telling a story during the snowfall to the climactic ending, Johnny Depp and Tim Burton surprisingly let us feel so many emotions: hope, fear, love, and more. It makes us fall in love with a character that looks and seems impossible to love. He may look like a monster, but despite his terrifying looks, he has a heart. Everyone has a heart. Wow, that was really cheesy. Also, half of this movie takes place at Christmas, so I really liked that. The final film I watched in November was A Boy Called Christmas, and all I have to say is, Merry Christmas, am I right? Just kidding, I gotta talk about it. I mean, why wouldn't I? Anyways, this movie was so generic and forgettable, I have barely anything to say. The special effects and acting are decent, I guess, and I like the magical Christmas atmosphere. But like I said while talking about Klaus, however, I really do not like Christmas movies that try to create their own origin story for Santa. They could easily just use their actual origin for the saint that lived in Turkey that was actually real in the 4th century. Just make a story about that. Jeez, it's not that hard, just adapt the story, my goodness. But yeah, this movie wasn't that good, sadly, and I can't really say I recommend it, even though it is on Netflix. But that's what I watched in November. I surprisingly watched a lot of good movies, which made for a pretty fun month. But stay tuned and subscribe to Cinema Ranks.